Alrighty, everyone, we're excited to get started. I want to welcome you to our webinar today, Onboard for Outcomes. My name is Leah Sheridan, and I'm a product marketer here at Pendo. Before getting started, we'll just go through a couple of housekeeping items. If you have questions during the webinar, please submit them using our Q&A function in the Zoom. We'll attempt to address some of these questions live as the time allows at the end. We'll also be sharing a recording of the webinar via email with everyone who registered within the next 24 hours. Now to talk about today's topic. So as I think a lot of you accept, onboarding is really a critical part of our customer journey and plays a big role in determining long-term customer health. It's especially an interesting topic, I think, for us, given the current situation, given that we can't facilitate live training sessions. So this idea of doing in-application onboarding, I think, is becoming increasingly important and obviously even essential in today's time. We're eager to outline how in-app onboarding can help increase certain internal efficiencies and ensure that users are finding value in your product, which of course is the primary goal. With that, I'll turn it over to our speaker, Eric Awashta, who's the product manager at Pendo, and he's responsible for our guides product. So with that, Eric, over to you.
Thank you so much, Leah. First of all, thank you everybody for taking the time to join this webinar today. We're excited to show you the content and kind of talk you through not only kind of the frameworks that we here at Pendo use for onboarding, but also just for taking the time out of your day today to talk about this topic. So let's jump right into it. So the first thing that we want to do is really define kind of onboarding and level set. We here at Pendo believe that onboarding is a process where you're helping your users find value in your product, right? And so that's the most important thing that you can do for a new user, is really kind of help guide them or help shepherd them to understanding the value that they believe that they want to get from your application or from your product. So why does this matter? So Bain did a study where on average, retention is the most impactful KPI in terms of long-term success for a business, right? And so when we surveyed about 1,000 of our customers, we found that the baseline was around 30% of retention. So being able to impact this KPI by helping these users understand their value, the value of your product earlier, is a huge opportunity. And so we typically see that there's like 3 models for onboarding onto a new product. The first is really self-discovery. There's not too much guidance. It's really relying on the user's intuition and the usability of a product to help them navigate and understand what they want to accomplish. The second, which I think most of us are familiar with, is human-assisted training sessions, live training sessions, when a customer success manager comes on site and helps teach the team that's about to use the product, or watching videos or accessing resources in some kind of help center or external help documentation resource. So the third one, which we're excited to talk to you about today, is the automated in-app onboarding. So this is placing in-app resources throughout your application that can leverage both of the other 2 models. So allowing users to access resources through self-help, but also taking any resources that you've already created, whether it's in a help documentation website or it's snippets of recordings from live training sessions, being able to pepper those throughout the application and help users kind of realize that value through these resources while they're in the application in context is really important. And I think that, you know, given today's climate, we're starting to see a shift more towards the latter, naturally, because there's less kind of face-to-face interaction that's recommended. We now have more people in the world working more remotely than ever before. It's a giant experiment. They're also, by virtue, relying on these applications or relying on technology to help navigate their day-to-day lives. Think through kind of my fiance just found out that she's going to be taking classes remotely in graduate school. So it's a big shift for everybody. And I think we want to be there to help as best we can and ensure that our users are transitioning into this remote kind of landscape as easily as they can. Now, there's something that we call the value gap here at Pendo, and that's where we have users that do a lot of research that are trying to understand a solution to a problem that they have. And so they develop some sort of expectation, right, of the value or the solution that they're going to get. Now, when they finally decide on a solution and purchase that solution or begin using it, then they start to understand the actual value that they're getting from that application or from that solution or from that product. And where there's a gap is where those expectations don't match up, right? Where the user thought that they were going to be able to accomplish X, Y, and Z, but once they actually jump in, it's either harder to use than they expected, or it's not as obvious, right? So that leads to what we call the value gap here at Pendo. And so onboarding is really a mechanism to help close that value gap. And so we're going to dive in a little bit deeper into how we actually can help you do that. So if you look at the diagram on the right, this is kind of the process by which we understand and start to break down what a first-time experience or onboarding process might look like. We actually work backwards. So we want to understand the value that we want the customer to realize first. That makes sure that we're aligned with whatever the users are trying to accomplish. And then from there, we do a lot of analysis, whether it's through anecdotal interviews, ethnographic interviews, or actual data analysis on usage data to understand what are the key indicators of that value or of that success. And so those milestones, they might be tasks within your application. They might be spending a certain amount of time in an application, or really just kind of understanding and being able to communicate the value to others. Maybe it's inviting others into the application or sharing content from the application or from the product. Those are the kinds of milestones that we typically see when our customers are trying to identify what these milestones are. And so we want to keep these milestones as high impact as possible. And so we recommend that we start small, in this case, less is more, and identify what are the 3 things that we really want to accomplish, or that we really want a customer to accomplish in order to realize that value as quickly as possible. And so as we continue to work backwards from there, then we ultimately get to their first login experience. And that now becomes your entire onboarding process from the moment that they first log in or gain access to the product to the point where they have that aha moment and they feel like they have accomplished what they initially set out to do. So let's break this down a little bit more. So how do we identify and kind of break down these milestones? How do we actually define success? And it's fairly straightforward, but it's these 4 steps. So understanding your users, that's kind of product management 101. Defining success, it might seem obvious, but it's actually one of the hardest things that we do here at Pendo, that we have to do here. And then forming hypotheses to test out how we move the needle on those success KPIs, and then ultimately iterating on those hypotheses to really make it as relevant to users as possible and adapt the content to the different needs of different types of users. So let's dive into each one of these. The first one is understanding your users. Again, this is kind of product management 101. But what we want to understand is not just what's the immediate problem that the user wants to solve, but how is this product fitting into the grand scheme of what that person is trying to accomplish? What are their values? What are their goals? Not only directly within the application, but you want to contextualize the problem that they're trying to solve. And that's what will help incorporate kind of the emotional aspects of problem solving, or getting frustrated in certain processes, or just different life circumstances that might be leading to finding a solution like what you might be offering. So these users, they can differ on a lot of different vectors, including things like technical proficiency or how they like to learn. We see trends like in customers that develop applications for the education technology space. Teachers and students have very different learning or different need to consume information in very different ways. And I'm sure that you all see those types of trends as you start to segment and understand your user base. You'll start to identify these kinds of specific needs that you wouldn't otherwise have without kind of really doing a deep dive into who these people are and what they're trying to accomplish. Now, the second thing is defining success. So when we were talking about the milestones, success can mean a lot of different things. It doesn't have to be a specific KPI. It could just be accomplishing a certain task or things like that. But we have some examples listed up here. And so are you trying to increase adoption of these key features and trying to get them to realize that value quicker? Maybe you're taking more of a long-term approach and ensuring that the customers are coming back and that the features and the product that you're building is really sticky. Maybe you're just trying to move the needle on a specific conversion event or a specific KPI or a specific point in the customer's life cycle. But it really depends on kind of the environment that your business is in and the stage that your business is in to ultimately pick and choose one of these. Now, what's really important to note is that as you define success for what it means for your users to become fully onboarded and to become kind of power users of your application, that the success that you define is very, very clear. We want to keep it as limited and scoped as possible, just so that you're focusing on the right things, right? It's really easy to say all 5 of these KPIs are important. But if we really zone in and focus on one, then we're able to structure tests or structure very specific processes around moving the needle of that one item, right? You can always have secondary KPIs, but when you're choosing a specific measure of success, try and keep it limited. And that's important because we're building hypotheses to test whether or not different changes or different ways of structuring the onboarding really move the needle on these success KPIs. So we want to make sure that kind of once we've developed a hypothesis, like whether or not a specific task is an indicator of success later down the road, again, going back to the definition of and scope of this hypothesis and of this test becomes really, really important. And I think it's important to note that there's a lot of different tools out there to help not only measure results of some sort of test or push out different iterations and different ways to test these hypotheses. But it's really important that you're measuring these hypotheses and judging success based off of all the different types of data that you could be collecting on your users. So not only like usage and behavioral data about where the users are clicking, what they're spending time on, but also going back to that emotional aspect of, are the users getting frustrated? Are they being delighted? How easy is this to use? What feedback? What do they wish that the application really had? or what step is missing in the task that they're trying to accomplish. All of this data, both quantitative and qualitative, is vital in helping you understand whether or not these are actually moving the needle. And then the last thing is onboarding is not a one-time, one and done type of thing. It's something that we want to make sure that as product leaders, we are continuously iterating on, right? Users change, the market changes, the world changes. And so we need to make sure that we're consistently learning and keeping things relevant, because if information that we put in front of a user is not relevant, it's very likely that they just won't pay attention to it. Maybe it's important information to help them onboard themselves or things like that. So there are a lot of different ways that you can make it relevant. Again, it goes back to kind of data capture, both on the quantitative and the qualitative side. But really understanding the context of who that user is, how are they using the application, information like when did they become a customer, have they become a customer yet? You know, potentially, are they power users? Are they used to using technology? What kind of NPS scores have they given you in the past? These are all different pieces of data that you can use to make whatever onboarding experience you're designing more relevant to the specific groups of users that you have. So at this point, I just want to speak a little bit to how Pendo can help accomplish all of this. It's really in 3 steps: the basics, which is creating a code-free onboarding solution or onboarding guide. This is pretty table stakes now for any new product on the market, to help customers realize that value and make sure that they continue to come back and that the application or the product is solving the problems that they want. So that's kind of the first step, is being able to build those generic kind of onboarding flows or guides. The next piece is really where we can tie the guide or the onboarding process to specific adoption or usage data. So being able to relate the guide to the outcome or to the success KPI is that second step, as we talked about. And then the third is really, how do you iterate on that? How do you collect data on an ongoing basis? How do you iterate and change what you've initially rolled out? And how do you start to break your users down into different groups of needs, right? And so I'm going to just hop into the Pendo application and show you all kind of how we can support you in each of these 3 steps, not only providing the basics, but tying those guides and those onboarding processes to the outcomes, and then how to experiment on an ongoing basis. Just to set this up a little bit, we'll use a scenario where we have a customer that has a CRM product. We know that adding context in this CRM is a really key indicator of retention and success of a user long-term. But it's not something that is super obvious for customers that might be new to this particular application. So what we're going to do is just show how we can use guides and different reports and different capabilities that Pendo has to kind of walk through this scenario. So this is a demo application. This is that Acme CRM. And I'm going to show you an example of an onboarding kind of experience, or a generic kind of table stakes onboarding experience. Users can do this self-help through what we call the Resource Center, and launch guides that might help them accomplish these key milestones that we were talking about earlier. So here's an example of how to create those contacts, right? I want to give the user a really short and sweet tour of how to actually accomplish this particular milestone, and give them context about maybe best practices, maybe linking out to specific information about how we fill out contacts. That's all totally viable data and viable information and viable resources to place within these onboarding guides. So now I've gotten the user to this point where they can now enter the contact name, the rep, the territory, etc., and submit, right? So what we wanted to do was get users to create this contact. So we created a guide that helped drive the users to accomplish that behavior. So these guides are really easy to use. And so now I'm moving over to the Pendo application, where I will show you kind of how easy it is to build these guides with a codeless solution. So what I'm going to do is I've created this guide already, just as an example for this webinar. There we go. All right. So when the Visual Design Studio loads over these applications, it's very, very point and click and easy to use. So here you can see I'm editing the first step of the guide. If I wanted to add content to this guide, it's very easy. I just click to add what we call a building block. And you can see we have a library of a lot of different types of information that we can put into these guides and different ways of engaging your users. So obviously we offer text blocks and button blocks, but we can also put images and GIFs and videos into these guides that might allow you to engage with different types of users or communicate different types of information to users in these different formats. I can change the look and feel of this guide to look exactly like my application. When your users see these guides on top of your application, they will look and feel exactly like your product. And so it won't set off any alarms to your customer or anything like that, because they're not going to know the difference between what these kind of in-context guides are, because they match the style and branding of your application. It's very easy to add steps as well. So I can go ahead and click into edit different steps. You can see that we can add different actions to buttons, and it's all very simple and codeless, right? So it makes it very easy to build an experience without needing or having to understand how to use code. So this is just an overview of what the building experience looks like in the Pendo application in the Visual Design Studio. I'm going to go ahead and show you some other ways and move into the second part of tying the guides to the application or to the outcomes that we're trying to drive. So here is an example. I'm looking at that particular guide, the Create a Contact guide, and we're starting to surface information about how these particular guides are being used. How are they being viewed? You can see that visitors are dropping off after a certain point. They might not be making it all the way through the guide. We have a lot of repeat visitors, not a lot of first-time visitors in this example. We can see that people are spending on average more time on the first and last step. You can also see and drill into specific users and see what they did or how they interacted with these guides. And so surfacing the information about how a guide is being used is really the first step. But now the important part is tying this data and overlaying this data with the actual outcomes that we wanted to drive. So here, I've navigated to a report builder or query builder that we have. It's called the Data Explorer, where we can generate graphs and reports about the specific insights that we want to surface. So in this case, what I want to do is I want to see of the people that view these guides, how does that match up to actually adding a contact, right? Layering on that guide view data with the contact information. So I've selected the guide views here, and I want to select the contact guide. And then I'm going to add a data source to look at feature clicks. And the feature that I'm going to look for is that create a contact or added a new contact. So now I can get a good kind of view of how these guide views might be impacting that outcome that I want to drive, that key milestone of adding a contact. So I'm going to just click run. And below we have a chart rendered with both pieces of information laid on top of each other. And now I can begin to drill in a little bit deeper. Maybe it's hiding or removing certain pieces of data to really begin to drill in. Now, we can also start to layer in segments or specific pieces of information that we know about the user. So this is getting into that third piece of understanding how to improve, right? So if I group by, let's just use role in this case. Let's see if there's any differences in how users are adding contacts based on their role. So again, here, now you can see that we've broken down the viewership of the guide and the task of adding a contact by user role. And so again, we can start to understand how these two pieces of information or how these two interactions might differ by the different types of people that are actually using this application. The last thing that I want to show you is the retention report. So this goes for a different type of success KPI that we might be interested in looking at. But here I can look at that specific feature, which is adding a contact. And begin to start to drill in and identify specific users that have or have not come back after adding their first contact. So again, more data visualization tools to help surface the quantitative side of how users are doing this. Now, when we talk about the qualitative side of how to improve, collecting feedback, we can go back and point back to specific guides, right? So what if at the end of the add a contact guide, we actually, let me just pull that up. What if after clicking and dismissing that last step, we showed a user a survey and asked, hey, how helpful was this? Do you have any suggestions about how to improve this experience or any steps that you see are missing? So now with Pendo, we can actually place those polls directly within those guides. So I'm going to go ahead and hop to this next step where in this case, we've entered a number poll. We also have text and multiple choice polls. But you can start to automate the process of collecting qualitative feedback or qualitative data about how useful a specific onboarding flow or step was. We surface all of this information to you. You can start to see, again, exactly how specific users, maybe specific roles, and I start to identify trends in how helpful or how useful a specific process was. So Pendo's a pretty powerful tool in not only helping you create your initial onboarding experiences, and kind of moving the user to close that value gap, but also to provide the analytics capabilities to tie that guide or tie that help to the outcome, and then ultimately surface feedback or automate the ability to collect feedback on how useful this particular experiment was. So I think that's pretty much all I have to show in the Pendo application itself. And I think at this point, we are ready to take any questions or dive deeper into any particular areas that users might want to see.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. This was super great. I'm actually going to keep that Pendo application up for a second because we had two questions that I think are relevant. One of them is the product tour different from onboarding, or is it just a way to implement onboarding? And I think this would be a great opportunity to highlight kind of the different formats that onboarding can take. I know we had a tooltip open on that retention page if you want to highlight that as well, but would love your perspective on that.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, what's nice about the guide building experience in Pendo is that it's very flexible. You can see that we can string together a number of steps into a multi-step walkthrough, but we can also surface different formats of guides. Like maybe a user wants a specific banner, right? So you want a banner to show at all times at the bottom of your application, at the top. Um, or we can also have these triggered by what we call badges or tooltips. So show a guide that might be anchored to an element. Let me show you. So here we have a tooltip. And we want to just put a tooltip explaining what this particular dashboard is whenever a user clicks on dashboard. So again, you can put whatever kind of content you want into these tooltips and choose how they're activated. But in terms of like onboarding, right? If we're thinking about onboarding, it's not just that first time walkthrough experience. It's the entire timeline from first login to realizing that value. So we recommend to our customers that they kind of pepper self-help type of interactions and self-help type of resources throughout the application. So really putting like little info icons that when you hover over them, they trigger guides that might have additional context. You saw me launch the original guide with what we call the resource center. So putting resources into the application that users can access at any time, not just that first onboarding walkthrough that we showed, that is definitely recommended, and we have the ability to support all of those types of use cases.
Thanks. I think in relation to the guide analytics, how do we see where users are dropping off within the guide?
Yeah, that's a great question. So let me go ahead and find the specific. So as we kind of drill into this page, and this is actually not something that I went too in depth in that initial demo, but we have this feature called segmentation, which basically allows you to filter any analytics or target any guides at a specific group of people. So let's just say that we wanted to look at admins. What we can do is, again, start to filter and analyze the specific guide metrics by these specific groups of people, or these specific people in some cases, right? Specific visitor IDs. And so here we can see that and use these tools that we provide to really try to drill in and identify those specific instances where there might be a drastic drop-off in how much a user might be engaging with this guide. So for example, if we see that customers are spending a lot more time on this first one, but not spending much time at all on the second, or if we see really drastic changes or differences in step viewership, then that's an indicator that maybe that first step wasn't as relevant as it could have been. And maybe we might want to try either segmenting that guide or trying a different message to see if we can improve the completion rates on that particular guide.
Yeah, and another interesting thing with Pendo, I think, to a lot of the points you've made, and we don't need to demo this now because it could take a minute, but I think we always try to have engagement analytics with the guide and the content itself, but also really measuring what that's doing to behavior in your application. So we have things like paths and funnels, which actually measure feature clicks. So you can see in the workflow that you're training on, where are people falling off in the actual app behavior? So you know, like, is this a problem with the workflow that I have to go fix? Or is this a problem with the guide that's a faster content fix, something like that. So I think we always try to cover both sides of the coin, both engagement analytics, as well as how is this actually influencing behavior in your application.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Great. Where does Pendo find the guides most successful in the customer journey? Is it close to the beginning? The end? Where do you really start with this?
Yeah, that's a loaded question, and I think it totally depends on the outcome that you're trying to drive, right? In their most basic form, guides, kind of if we go back to that this slide, guides are really a means to an end, right? You're trying to drive some behavior, trying to make sure that customers are informed with some type of knowledge. And so I think you have to start with what the outcome is that you're trying to drive, whether it's, I want my users to be more knowledgeable about this particular part of the application, or I want to actually move the needle on a specific KPI. And that will help you determine where and when in the customer lifecycle that you begin to put these guides. We typically find that like generally less is more. And what I mean by that is users tend to drop off with, guides that might be 6, 7, 8, 10, 20 steps. So being really diligent about making sure that you're delivering the right content at the right time is the most impactful way to do that. Additionally, because we support the different types of guides like banners or tooltips or badges, being able to pepper in these little kind of moments of education, maybe a user hovers over an information icon and that shows them a link to your help documentation, or gives a user a little bit of a tip on how to accomplish what they're doing better. Those are always beneficial, but again, less is more, and we want to make sure that we're delivering the most relevant content.
Yeah. Another great question. If you're a B2B business and you're combining manual training by customer success with this in-app training, what do you think that balance should look like? How do they live together?
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't believe that this is going to be a complete replacement of kind of personal training. We're really getting putting that to the test right now in today's climate. But I do believe that they are kind of hand in hand. So we do see specific customers that might take little snippets of specific trainings or best practices that come out of those trainings and learnings that come out of those trainings, and then really operationalizing them into the application through guides for the benefit of all their customers, right? Additionally, we see scenarios where customers might hold some sort of in-person training or virtual training, and then survey the users that were in that training maybe a week later. Like you attended this particular training. How did that help you? Let me collect that feedback, and that's all collected directly in app rather than sending additional emails or following up and things like that. We typically see higher engagement rates or higher conversion rates with that kind of content when it's sent through the application.
Great. I'm going to ask this one next, because I think it goes to this idea of making really relevant training for the users, as you were talking about, whether it's live or an application. And there's a question about whether the steps in a single workflow can be different for types of users based on their login ID. So the example was, obviously new users may need more detailed steps, whereas more experienced users may only need a few. How does Pendo deal with that?
Yeah, that's a great question. It goes back to that segmentation feature that I showed, where we can create specific groups of people. And so what we'd want to do is create 2 separate guides targeted at 2 different people or 2 different segments or audiences, and only guides that are relevant to the audience would show. So users would not see both versions of the guide. They would only see the one that is relevant to the audience that they are actually in.
Yeah, and I think this is huge when we talk about efficiencies and how you can make your onboarding process just take fewer hours. I think because there's this level of personalization that you can build into the workflows and automate, we've just found that this can save a ton of time and be way more efficient in how you're onboarding some of your users and application while still ensuring they're getting that white glove experience. So I think it's a really cool feature. This is an interesting one. Who typically owns creating Pendo guides? Product management, content and training teams, etc.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think the short answer is that it totally depends on the types of resources that your company has. That's mostly correlated with like the size of your company. We typically find that in smaller companies, it might just be one product manager or one customer success operations manager or a product marketing manager that's building most of the guides. Whereas at larger enterprises, there might be entire teams, ones that might be focusing on the content, then it gets handed over to the UI or the UX designers. to make sure the styling all looks right. And then the product manager might be the one to actually publish or push those guides out into the application. So I think it does depend. Here at Pendo, we have a specific kind of internal team that we call the Pendo Internal Management Team that has representatives from product marketing, from product ops that help verify the content, the styling, and the behavior of those guides to make sure that what we're putting out is quality and not frustrating users in any way.
Great. I'll end with this last one because it's a bit timely. I think we saw, especially with Slack's new UI, that there is some balance between improving UI versus using onboarding to help get people on board. Is it really about making your UI more intuitive or using tools like onboarding to help create guidance? What's your perspective on that?
Yeah, that's an interesting question because everyone, right, always wants a more intuitive UI. However, a UI is really kind of a way to build and break habits in specific workflows. So even though we might be changing application user interfaces to be more intuitive, there's going to be some level of change management of all the people who developed their habits and workflows on the old user interface or in other applications. And so onboarding and kind of ongoing in-app education is a way to break old habits for the benefit of the improvements that you're putting out there. And it's also a way to reinforce those habits that once you start to build them, they're constantly reinforced and the application is actually helping the user get better at those things. So I do think that because of that, it's always going to be a balance. It's always going to be some level of breaking old habits and building new ones. And in-app guidance is a way to really help drive that behavior in context as the user is doing it, rather than asking them to remember, once that transition actually does happen.
Great. I really appreciate all the great questions that have been asked. I know we're running short on time, so if we didn't get to one of your questions and you really like to chat about it, we love that. Just email us at webinar@pendo.io. So just the word webinar at pendo.io, and we're eager to have that conversation with you. And sorry we couldn't get to it today. Just a few closing notes. So as a reminder, we will send out a recording of this webinar in case you want to reference it again. We really appreciate all of you tuning in, and thank you to Eric for sharing all those great insights with us. If you're interested in this topic, I have good news. Pendo will be releasing a lot of content around onboarding in the coming weeks, including more detailed how-to guides and more things around the topics Eric has discussed today. Yesterday, we actually launched our first how-to guide, which is getting started with in-app onboarding, which is a refresher on a lot of the topics Eric covered. So be sure to go to Pendo's website and check that out if you want to take a deeper dive. And we'll definitely be sharing more over the coming weeks, as I mentioned, if you're interested in that topic. So stay tuned. And we appreciate everyone for joining. We hope it was helpful, and we look forward to sharing more with you soon. Thanks.